All right, so the second moral foundation is what Haidt calls fairness cheating. And it goes to this idea that humans have this fundamental sense that things should be fair, and they get angry when they perceive that someone else is cheating. And he goes through various examples about why this might be biologically wired. Among other things, there are studies that animals, including our close relatives primates, have this sense. There are studies where like a chimp will get mad if he sees another chimp getting more than he gets, and so forth. And so, this is another fundamental thing we get worked up about. And a really famous study from behavioral economics, which, if you recall, we talked about back when we had a normal class, is so there's a very famous study in behavioral economics, which remember we talked about back when we had a normal class, behavioral economics, that is known as the ultimatum game. And it kind of illustrates this human propensity to have this strong sense of fairness and fighting against injustice. And the way the game works is there are two people, and you give one of them, say, $10. And the person who has $10 basically can give some of it away to the other person. And let's say, for example, Joe gives Jane $1, and Jane basically has a choice. Jane can either accept the dollar or reject the dollar. If she accepts the dollar, she gets to keep $1, and Joe gets to keep the other 9. Cool. Alternatively, she can reject the dollar. And if Jane rejects the dollar, she is also effectively taking away the $9 from Joe. Basically, no one gets anything. So again, to review those points, either she accepts Joe's offer and she gets something and Joe gets the rest, or she rejects Joe's offer and no one gets anything. Now, I want you to think about what might happen in this game. What do you think are the kind of offers that Joe might give Jane? What do you think are some of the offers that Jane will accept? I'll remind you that if Jane is behaving entirely rationally, so to speak, she should accept any offer that she is given, right? I mean, if she is offered $1, she should take $1 because it's $1 more than she had before. She has nothing to gain by rejecting it, right? And yet, you might know where this. So, here is what actually happens. This chart shows what percentage of the time Jane in the scenario, actually accepts the offer depending on what is offered. So for example, on the far right here, if Joe keeps 90% of the money, $9, and gives her just 10% of the money, $1, she will only accept it 5% of the time. 95% of the time she says, nope, I'm not taking it, and you're not getting anything either. If he offers her $2 or 20% of the pot, she'll accept it 17% of the time. If he gives her $3 or 30% of the pot, she'll accept it about 80% of the time. And by the time you're offering, 35% of the pot, 40% of the pot, 50% of the pot, then the Jane in the scenario almost always accepts it. Now let's stop for a moment. We talked about Homo economicus before the break. Homo economicus, that is a purely rational operator, would accept any offer that was given, right? Because it's still better than 0, right? Like that would be better to get $1 than 0, but that's not how humans work. Humans, like Jane in this scenario, bristle at the idea that they're only being given 1, while Joe gets 9. What did you do to deserve 9? And they'll say, screw you, Joe, I'm going to punish you. That is, and this study has been replicated lots of times with lots of different tweaks, and there's all these different versions of it, and there's various evidence of this. People will gladly accept a worse outcome for themselves if it ends up punishing someone they think deserves to be punished, right? And so this is, again, trying to get this idea that across cultures, and by the way, there are differences across cultures. Some cultures are more willing to accept lower offers than others. But anyway, still, across cultures, there's a willingness to reject a bid out of a sense of this is unjust, and I'm going to punish you for basically cheating and not playing fair. So by the way, if you're wondering what ends up usually happening, usually the Joes of the world, the person giving the offer, will give about half and half, or sometimes something like 60-40. That's easily the more common thing to do than to try to screw the person over by giving them just 1, in part because they're afraid of not getting their money. They know the way humans think. All right. What does this all have to do about politics? Well, This sense of fairness and injustice and cheating certainly runs through much of our political rhetoric. In this regard, look at these two protest signs from the early 2010s. The seniors may remember this is the era of Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party. The juniors haven't learned about that yet, but maybe you remember it. You would have been kids. But in any case, after the recession in the early 2010s, there are these kind of big angry movements. And on the left is an Occupy Wall Street sign. Right, marching for the weak and weary, hungry and homeless, tax the wealthy fair and square. How can they, be rich while the poor go hungry every day, right? Versus spread my work ethic, not my wealth. I posit that both of those things are manifestations of this fairness idea. But one is a more liberal idea of fairness, and one is a more conservative idea of fairness. And that is the prompt I want you to respond to. What's the difference between these two definitions of fairness that are being exemplified in these two signs? What is the difference between the definition on the left and on the right? I will also pose to you this question. This is the second prompt. Can you think of another example of the Fairness Cheating Foundation in action? Another example of how either liberals or conservative would find something unfair in society. So an example of the kind of way that a liberal or conservative would talk about there's this cheating going on that cannot be allowed to stand. I'll let you respond to both of those.